I monitor alien activity for a living, and the day I asked the question I wasn't supposed to ask is the day my life stopped being mine. The room was small and deliberately ordinary. Gray walls, a table that had seen decades of hands, a single lamp tilted like a tired moon. I remember the way the light fell on the observer's hands, if you can call them hands, the slow, precise movements that never looked hurried. My palms sweated even though I had done this for years. I told myself it was protocol, nerves, the weight of another routine interview added to a pile of routine interviews. I kept my notebook open. The word protocol was printed on the first page in my own block letters. Date, time, subject, question. I had asked hundreds of questions. I had trained to keep my voice flat, to follow the script. He didn't blink. That detail lodged itself in me later like a splinter you keep picking at. In the moment, it felt like an omission, a tiny lack that made the room tilt. He simply observed, and observation landed like a weight. His face, if it was a face, held no expression I could map. He measured the sound of my breath as if measuring the breath itself. When I posed the question I had rehearsed a dozen different ways, something else happened. Not the answer, the absence of an answer. "What do you want from us?" I asked. Careful, professional, looking for a line I could record, a category I could file. Silence filled the space the way snow fills a valley, soft, total, unexpected. It wasn't the quiet that comes between words. It was the kind of silence that changes temperature. The lamp hummed. My pen stopped halfway across the page. For an instant the room felt larger and then impossibly small. There was pressure behind my eyes. The observer tilted his head a fraction of a degree, less than the motion of a human hearing, and the air in the room rearranged itself. It felt like being under glass with someone watching from the outside. He spoke finally, but not in words I could write. The sound was a placement, a shift. It wasn't about information, it was measurement. He imposed a scale on me. When he finished, I had the impression I had been weighed and catalogued and sent back to my life with a marking I couldn't see but could somehow feel. Afterwards, I left the room with my notebook closed and a tremor in my hand that lasted until I got to my car. Somewhere between there and the street, a ceramic cup, a chipped mug with a logo from a conference I hadn't gone to, slipped from my grasp and shattered on the sidewalk. The pieces glittered like tiny moons. People walked around them. Someone muttered, the kind of throwaway sympathy reserved for strangers. I picked one shard up and kept it in my pocket. It shouldn't have fit there, and it did. It became an anchor. If that sounds melodramatic, I understand. I told myself that for days afterward. Yet the thing that came next didn't fit into the tidy categories I had spent a career defending. I started noticing small alignments that could have been coincidence. A friend called right after I thought of them. A red car passed my window at the exact second I checked the time. My coffee tasted different when I stirred it counterclockwise. I wrote the observations down because that is what monitors do. Record, test, repeat. If you like these kinds of field reports, subscribe. I don't want to sell you fear. I want to share what we learn. The first experiments were crude, almost childish. I made a list one morning while the city outside my apartment made its habitual noises. 1. Cinnamon in coffee. 2. Blink count for 2 minutes. 3. Call the number in my phone and hang up. I did them the way a scientist does an embarrassingly simple control, with repeated care. The cinnamon test, performed on a Tuesday in a mug with a hairline crack, seemed to produce nothing unusual. Then, as if the test had sent a confession into the world, my upstairs neighbor's music stopped, the kind of abrupt stop you only hear when someone is holding their breath. 10 minutes later, she knocked on my door, apologizing for running out of toilet paper and asking if I had any to spare. I gave her 2 rolls. Her gratitude was a small, bright thing. Later, in my notebook, I cross-referenced the time I had stirred and the time she had knocked and drew a line between them as if that line could be smoothed into cause. The blink test was worse because it taught me how subtle the mechanism could be. I sat in my car with the engine off and counted each blink for exactly 2 minutes, palms sweating against the steering wheel. At the end of the count, a delivery van pulled into the parking space directly beside mine, its driver cursing into a phone about directions. He slammed a package down and left, not because of me, I told myself, but because the 2 minutes of my blinking had weight to it. A week later, I found myself describing the test to a colleague in a tone meant to be amused. He laughed politely and changed the subject. When his calendar that afternoon filled with last-minute cancellations for a departmental meeting he had been counting on to secure a promotion, I stopped feeling amused. The laugh tasted bitter. The phone call ritual on its face seemed the least mystical. I dialed an old number, the one from a girl I had dated for 6 months in my 20s and then drifted from without cause, and hung up before the automated message began. 10 minutes later, her name lit up my screen. She left a voicemail that said, "I was just thinking about you," in the exact way someone says it when they have been thinking about you for a long time. I saved the voicemail. I put it on a playlist and listened to it until the edges of the words smoothed out. I don't know why I did that. I only know that the playlist became its own ritual. Rituals are how we make sense of things that won't otherwise be counted. These were small, unthreatening outcomes, the sort of things you could still explain away if you wanted to. A line of confirmation bias, dressed up in a notebook, could still be a lie, except the pattern moved. It did not stay in the small. It escalated in discrete steps, each one pronounced, each one making me less likely to sleep. The first larger event was a neighborhood argument over a parking space that spiraled beyond what parking disputes normally do. 2 men shouted. Sounds like this start fast and are over faster than you can narrate them, but when you are watching the accumulation of human attention, seconds are long. The shouting drew a cluster of onlookers. Phones were raised. The argument swelled into accusations about money and slights and history. Then someone shoved. A bottle broke. A dog barked and then yelped. A window on a nearby storefront popped under the pressure of something unseen, scattering glass into the afternoon. 2 people were taken away in the back of a patrol car later that evening, and the air smelled of chemical cleaner for weeks. I had watched the initial flare. People had been feeding it with their anger for hours, a slow, simmering stew of resentment that hardened into action. I drew a map of the block that night. I marked the houses where arguments had begun months earlier, the corner where a rumor had started about a landlord evicting tenants, the cafe where a waitress had been yelled at for getting an order wrong. Lines connected these points like veins. The more lines I drew, the clearer the picture. Certain nodes pulsed red on my page. At work, a whole floor of my agency developed inexplicable flu-like symptoms over the course of a week. HR chalked it up to a seasonal bug. I had watched a meeting where tempers had been high, where projections were cut, where an executive's tone had been lit cigarette mean. Employees left early, sick calls multiplied. The building instituted a cleaning protocol and a temporary ban on communal food. When I overlaid the dates on my notebook map, the sick cluster aligned with the meeting's memory of fear and dread. It was not that fear caused an infection. It was that fear clustered, and then something else, human bodies, services, markets, responded. I began to stop using the word coincidence as a comfort and use it only as a term under observation. I became lost inside a modest, private terror. My nights turned to a thin tape of wakefulness and note-taking. I argued with myself. I was a trained observer. My job was to keep distance. The observer had told me nothing explicit about this mechanism. He had only left his mark, a permission, a scar, a sense that some threshold had been crossed by me, by us, the day I had asked. I tried to document, to create a disciplined protocol. Each entry in my notebook felt like a lifeline. Protocol 7. Observe personal micro-emotion, irritation, for 10 minutes. Log external events for 24 hours.
Protocol 9. Focus and intent scenario and missed train, and record frequency of target event in 48 hours. I wrote 100 such small, clumsy experiments. I numbered them like commandments, and then violated them by letting my life be swept by them. It is strange to confess that I felt important sometimes. I felt like someone who had been given a new lens and had a moral obligation to test it. I also felt terrified because the lens seemed to show not just connections, but a capacity. Repeated human emotion, when concentrated and sustained, could amplify certain outcomes. That capacity carried no morality in its geometry. Anger amplified anger. Fear scabbed over into scarcity. Joy, if organized and prolonged, seemed to make a small room of ordinary luck. A parking space appears. A phone rings with an offer. A rain cloud parts at a picnic. The moral hazard was immediate. Good intentions could have consequences as much as bad ones. An hour spent meditating on abundance might ripple in ways I could not predict. A viral thread of outrage could accumulate into a blackout of services in a city. A few weeks after the interview, I started receiving messages in places I had not expected. A slip of paper left under my windshield wiper with an arrow doodled on it, an email sent from a burner account asking if I was the Harold who saw the tilt, a postcard with no return address that said only in block letters, "Meet." Each communication suggested eyes on me. The way my career had involved watching strangers now inverted, I might be the watched. I followed a trail of breadcrumbs because that is what monitors do. A return address pointed to a vacant lot behind a row of shuttered shops. There, at dusk, a man leaned against a dumpster reading a newspaper he did not look at. He introduced himself as James, but corrected me when I used his name in conversation. He called himself a mapper. "You keep a notebook," he said when he saw mine. "You make lines." "That's a job hazard," I said. He laughed like someone coming back from a long walk into cold weather. "No, you map in the wrong way. You use the city as a map. We use the city as a body." We walked first, because that seemed right. He pointed at streetlights that flickered, at alleys where people gathered like little cells of heat. He gestured toward the older buildings with the thick plaster that keeps sound dampened and the modern glass towers that amplify it. He had a card with a word I had not seen used in a report in 15 years, node. He spoke in half-technical, half-poetic terms. He told me about a wall he kept, a physical mess of thread and pins and printed photographs that he called his mapping wall. He said the real work was not seeing the lines, but understanding which lines were being fueled. "You don't want to be the only person paying attention to one line," he said. "It burns quicker." He told me about the first time he noticed influence on a scale that couldn't be written off as coincidence.
It involved a local teacher who had spent a term terrified of budget cuts. For weeks, the teacher talked in the staff room about the cuts, until the talk morphed into the fear people wore, and then the school actually lost its funding. The teacher's dread hung in the air like fog. James used the example not to curse the teacher, but to show that concentrated attention had vector and momentum. "People don't think attention is a resource," James said. "They think it's just what you have or don't have in a moment. They don't see it's something that moves between people, an economy. We built a ledger." He led me to an address that was not on any map. The door, when we found it, was unmarked and heavy. Inside the lobby, the air smelled of dust and citrus cleaner. A narrow stairway curled down to a basement that felt like a lung. The room at the bottom had the musty warmth of a place that had been inhabited by people who did not want to be found. On one wall, a map of the city unfurled across plywood. Strings of different thicknesses crossed the map like veins. Pushpins marked locations. Photographs were tacked under the strings. Some were of faces, some of storefronts, some of screens showing headlines. The map had the deliberate chaos of an organism. It was the first time I had seen something I had only sketched in the margins of my notebook realized into scale. "You call that a wall?" I asked. He smiled then, small and private. "It's a proof." It felt like an accusation. I had been working alone with my obsessions and my shattered cup in my pocket. To see that someone else had sewn a lattice out of other people's headaches made the fear suddenly communal and therefore more plausible. James introduced me to two other people who hovered by the edge of the wall, a woman who kept audio recordings and called herself a receiver because she trusted her body to feel the swell of public mood, and an ex-military man with a calmness that made his knuckles look like they had been hammered into place, who called himself a blocker, and explained that part of his role was to create conditions that prevented escalation not by force, but by changing how people could gather their attention. "We're small," James said. "We do not do public announcements. We test and we seed. We do not tell people what to feel. That would be another kind of violence." They showed me their protocols, how to note the first whisper of fear, how to trace it to a node of repeat attention, how to gently attenuate by inserting small acts of ordinary presence. Their ethics were both minimal and immense, never to command, always to model. I wrote down everything they said in my notebook in black ink and then in red, like adding corrections to a draft of the world. In the weeks that followed, the group grew in the way quiet rooms collect secrets. A retired teacher joined after claiming she had been seeing lines for years without a name for them. She brought stacks of old notices and PTA minutes.
An artist came with diagrams that looked like constellations and insisted art could change the density of attention. A soft-spoken woman who had worked as a nurse on high-stress shifts said she could sense when crowds were about to turn inward like a tide. Each person contributed a way of noticing that the observer had not taught me, but that I had always trusted. The human mind tries to fill in patterns. There were degrees of skepticism among them that kept the meetings honest. Not everyone accepted that sustained emotion produced external events. Some of them came because the observer had been seen by their neighbors. They wanted to understand why an entity one could not explain would stand in a room and tilt their head at a question. Others came because they had watched their small worlds fall into loops of fear. People had lost jobs, relationships, and a kind of quiet trust that makes errands easy and nights restful. They came to learn how to live again without feeling like every thought was a match near dry tinder. We tried to be scientific about it. We created tests that passed the smell test, repeatable conditions, controlled variables, delays, and blind procedures when possible. We called our notes field reports rather than evidence because evidence implied a totality we did not possess. The lattice wall grew. I should have. An artist came with diagrams that looked like constellations and insisted art could change the density of attention. A soft-spoken woman who had worked as a nurse on high-stress shifts said she could sense when crowds were about to turn inward like a tide. Each person contributed a way of noticing that the observer had not taught me, but that I had always trusted. The human mind tries to fill in patterns. There were degrees of skepticism among them that kept the meetings honest. Not everyone accepted that sustained emotion produced external events. Some of them came because the observer had been seen by their neighbors. They wanted to understand why an entity one could not explain would stand in a room and tilt their head at a question. Others came because they had watched their small worlds fall into loops of fear. People had lost jobs, relationships, and a kind of quiet trust that makes errands easy and nights restful. They came to learn how to live again without feeling like every thought was a match near dry tinder. We tried to be scientific about it. We created tests that passed the smell test, repeatable conditions, controlled variables, delays, and blind procedures when possible. We called our notes field reports rather than evidence because evidence implied a totality we did not possess. The lattice wall grew. I should have been comforted by company. Instead, the more we compared notes, the more terrified I became. The lattice we kept discovering was not linear. It had loops and feedback. A rumor on one side of the city would curl and feed itself until a coordinated series of small harms occurred. A line of layoffs at a factory, a supply chain hiccup that made medicine scarce in a clinic, a sudden outbreak of conflict in a neighborhood where old injuries had not been allowed to heal. The geometry of it suggested that not only could attention push things into being, but when certain nodes aligned globally, the output multiplied. We began to slot these alignments into a vocabulary I had never used in a report: build-up, resonance, critical mass. The word critical mass felt obscene to say aloud because it read like a mathematical certainty where none should be. Yet the maps kept pointing to moments when lines converged: economic unease, political tension, a pandemic fear wave. And in those moments, ordinary misfortune became merciless. We'd sit in the basement, coffee gone cold, and trace the paths of those convergences with fingers. "Imagine," the artist said once, tapping a red thread that ran from a neighborhood shelter to an online forum and then outward into a series of news links. "These are like chords. Some carry weight, some carry nothing. But when enough chords tie to the same knot, the knot changes the fabric." He liked fabric metaphors. He had wide hands and made his thoughts into theater. "What do we do?" I asked, because that is the question people wear like clothes when they are scared. He shrugged. "We do what we can. We try to take pressure off knots. We try to seed other threads." The more honest members of the group admitted that they did not have a cure. There was no vaccine for attention. We had no neat protocol to neutralize a fear camp in a town square. The observer had not given us a formula. He had only sat and tilted his head as if to say, "You are at the edge of learning, Harold." And then he had left me with a mark and a responsibility I had not first consented to. That responsibility layered like dust on every decision I made. At night, I would find myself replaying the interview, pressing the memory of that tilt under a flashlight like an archivist handling a relic. I would flip to pages in my notebook where my handwriting had hurried into jagged columns and try to read them in search of hints. Some margins were blank, some had symbols: a coin sketched 3 times, a red car circled twice, a broken cup shaded. Those were the motifs that kept appearing in my experiments and in our group discussions. Symbols multiplied significance when you saw them repeat. During this period, I met a woman named Mara who called herself a tester. She was blunt and quick and had a laugh that sounded like a tool snapping into place. She had been a logistics analyst for a humanitarian group and had a habit of designing small interventions to see if they would shift outcomes. Mara believed that low-intensity tests, repeated across different conditions, could produce signals strong enough to be noticed without forcing a wholesale change. She favored what she called gentle nudges,
a mural painted in a block where rumors gathered, a free coffee cart at a transit hub on a day people expected to be chaotic, a word of recognition offered with no agenda. Her first demonstration for the group was a simple one. On a Friday morning, when a rumor about food shortages had been spreading in a certain district, she posted flyers in neutral places, library bulletin boards, laundromat doors, with a single sentence: "Stay, you are seen." It was basic, nearly cloying, and it was the sort of thing I would have rolled my eyes at if it had come from an NGO. But something happened. The line in the local grocery that week stopped 2 extra disputes from erupting. Someone returned a lost wallet to a shop they had assumed was too far. A rumor that had been leaning toward panic found a small groove of ordinary civility and rolled into it. Mara called the effect a friction dampener. I called it a miracle in my notebook, because naming things anchors them. The group argued about whether to ascribe causality. I found I didn't care to be strict. I only cared about whether it worked. Not everything worked. We learned too much by failing. A mural we commissioned in a neighborhood with a history of territorial gangs was defaced within hours.
No amount of careful wording or gentle nudging could change the fact that a possible flashpoint existed in that area due to structural inequality and generational injuries. Sometimes our nudges simply revealed deeper, uglier lines. It was infuriating and humbling. The observer's presence hung over these experiments like a question. He did not intervene when a nudge failed. He did not fix the harm when our interventions misfired. The mark he left on me felt less like a tool and more like an instruction to learn how to carry weight without breaking others. The language he used, if it could be called language, seemed to suggest that knowledge of a system imposes an ethical tax. You can see that a ball is rolling toward a child, but you cannot reach out and stop the push without altering everything that follows. Free will, he had seemed to insist, is absolute. Intervention is not. The ethical pressure translated into politics among us. Some members argued we needed to be bolder, to call people out, to demand awareness. Others, including the retired soldier who had joined later, argued for smaller footprints. Demonstrate the alternative rather than preach it. The soldier's presence was a stabilizing force. He would show up late, take his hat off in the corner, and speak calmly about logistics, ways to move a crowd, how to create exits, how to place volunteers who could model a calm presence. He refused to see the world as a battlefield. Battlefields for me were places you had to clear, he said. Here you need to open space. When I began to sleep, I dreamt of lines and lattices. I woke with the taste of metal and the memory of an eye tilting in the dark. Sometimes I would find myself tracing the path of a thread across the wall map late at night, like a penitent. The map became a prayer rug of sorts. We would turn it on its side and see new patterns. The group's methods refined into a set of practices that we applied in different cities. We kept spreadsheets. We logged outcomes. We discovered, not surprisingly, that the more people acted on an idea, the more power that idea had to shape realities. It wasn't magic that counted, it was mass. Once, at a meeting where the coffee had gone cold and everyone was tired, James pulled a sheaf of printed articles from the drawer of a battered desk. They were clippings of reports from other countries, old and new. Some described mass hysteria. Others described cultural shifts where communities had collectively chosen to change diet, to relocate rituals, to stop rituals. The clippings were disorganized, fragments of histories that may or may not be comparable. But the patterns suggested a history of species making choices that, when they aligned with structural conditions, produced profound change. The observer mentions others, James said quietly. He means there were people before who touched the same threshold. It didn't go well for them. We're not a new experiment. We're a second-hand transcript.
That mention of previous species, vague, fragmentary, tightened my throat. The line between metaphor and literalness narrowed. I saw the artifact in my pocket, the shard of cup, and wondered what mark it would make if it were dropped into a lake of attention. We argued about whether to use the language of species at all. It sounded apocalyptic. It also seemed like an honest way to hold the stakes without seeking spectacle. One evening, after a failed test where a choir we'd instructed to sing at a transit hub only drew a smaller crowd than expected, Mara and I walked back to the subway in silence. A street vendor's cart was lit with fairy lights. A group of teenagers argued about the latest game. We had tried to see joy and had been met with indifference. We had also seen small victories in other neighborhoods. The discrepancy made the scale of influence feel arbitrary and cruel. "Do you think we're changing things?" Mara asked abruptly. I wanted to say yes in a way that absolved me of responsibility. Instead, I said, "I think we're making tiny edits in a manuscript that is thousands of pages long." "That's not comforting." "No, it's not." I closed my notebook. The pages had a habit of fluttering like insect wings when the wind picked up in the stairwell. I felt, more than saw, the tilt of my own attention toward fear, an old reflex I had to catch and redirect. I had to remind myself to turn the cursor of my mind to things that could withstand scrutiny, family dinners, bills that needed paying, the minor ordinance of daily life. This practice felt like training for an invisible marathon. Our small group began to track a pattern I had not expected. Institutions could act like amplifiers. A rumor caught on the pages of a widely read column and then spread outward like a drop in an aquarium, sending fishes scattering against corners. Markets reacted to mood as much to data. Hospital administrations reacted to fear with administrative protocols that sometimes starved care in the way procedures can when they are over-applied. It was worrying because institutions had scale. One small panic in a news cycle could produce policy moves that hardened into months or years of suffering when aggregated across geographies. We started to imagine how, if left unchecked, the lattice of attention could align into something we would call a cascade. The word made us all uneasy. A cascade suggested a point of no return. The group used metaphors to avoid the true terror of naming it. We called it going glass, an image the artist liked because it evoked fragile surfaces that gave way without much warning. Glass breaks quietly, until it doesn't. The history clippings James kept suggested that other collectives had gone glass before, though the reasons were never plain. Compounding fear, unexamined fury, a blindness to consequence.
The observer's warning, if that is what it had been, echoed in our private spaces like a ticking that had no cadence we could parse. I kept thinking of the tilt of his head and of the cup. Both had the same geometry, an ordinary object altered by an unexpected force, a rupture you could not fix by sweeping the shards away. We had to learn to orient not just to the event, but to the cultivators of attention, people who, either intentionally or from habit, fed lines for others to follow. When the woman with the voice that made other people's moods palpable joined us, she said she had been a receiver for years and had moved her life to avoid crowded centers because crowds were where her body felt the most pressure. She described a ritual she performed when a feeling got too large. She would put a hand to a window and whisper a color into it. It sounded like superstition, useless and tender, but she said it worked for her. It gives the feeling somewhere to go, she said, like giving a headache a name. That sentence lodged in me. Giving things names is the oldest human trick for controlling them. We named storms, gave months to gods, and called what we feared by cheap, manageable words. It makes the world tractable. Our group began to build a vocabulary for attention: node, pull, resonance, dampening. Language does not change the world on its own, but it frames the choices we make about it. I began to map my own circle of influence with the same rigor I brought to any field report. Who did I talk to? Where did my words travel? Which neighborhoods did I pass through on my way to work? Which online forums did I inhabit late at night? The questions felt both narcissistic and essential. If attention had direction, mine was not neutral. I had been an instrument. The observer's tilt made that clear in a way that never left me. One afternoon, as I was cross-referencing an incident at a nursing home with a thread about a supply shortage, James called me into the basement with a seriousness I had not often seen on his face. He pointed at a cluster of pins near the center of the map, a place where several threads converged, like tributaries at the mouth of a river. "The feeds are thickening," he said. "We've got resonance around healthcare and distribution in this sector. A rumor's been seeded about vaccine access. It's spreading." We sat in the low light and watched the map with something like dread. The pins shivered in the soft breeze from an open window. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. The world slowed into a heartbeat we could hear. "It could be weeks," Mara said. "It could be days." "You think the observer would tell us a countdown?" I asked, feeling as if I had said the word out loud would make it true. James did not answer with certainty. Instead, he dug out another document, a scrap of paper with a hastily drawn graph that suggested rise, plateau, collapse. "We don't know his metric," he said.
We only know his tendency to name when the geometry gets tight. He mentioned others and their failure. That tells us something. The word terrifying fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird. It was a ridiculous word for the work we did because it implied spectacle. Our work was slow and patient and tactile and boring until it was. Terrifyingness, in our frame, would be a lattice so taut that the seams were brittle. It would be a moment when hundreds or thousands of small repeated fears synchronized and produced a large irreversible effect. The implication was chilling. If human attention had the power to build reality, then a concentrated current of fear could build a reality where scarcity and hostility were the architecture. That idea, that repetition plasticizes reality, made my palms damp. It also made me feel responsible in a way that was both right and unbearable. I had asked the question and been marked by the answer. I had the ability to watch the threads and perhaps through small acts fray them, but I also knew that I could not save everyone. Free will existed. The observer had insisted on that. There was no remote control. We could not prevent people from choosing what to think or feel. "Then what do we do?" someone asked, a question we had been avoiding by busy work. James tapped at the pins and then drew a line from a safe zone, a community garden in green thread, to a red zone, a cluster of rumoring forums. We seed other nodes. We model a different attention. We try to grow enough healthy threads that the whole fabric doesn't snap. The metaphor felt fragile. I wanted data. I wanted to press a button that could tell me the probability of catastrophe. But in the basement, with the thread map humming, there was no button. There were only small, precise acts. A mural here, a coffee cart there, a choir here, and a conversation there. The next day, I walked home through an evening that smelled of rain. A red car slid past in the slick street. I had drawn that car in my notebook twice already, as part of an experiment. The coin I had flipped in a cafe landed on edge once, the only time I had seen such a thing in my life. These anomalies began to pile into a story that pressed on me like a fist. I memorized the tilt of the observer's head, the way a soldier memorizes the contour of a hill before an assault. There was no assault here, only a slow collation of wills. When I reached my apartment, the shard from the cup was still in my pocket. It had cut a thin line along my palm. The skin healed into a pale ridge. Sometimes late at night, I would rub my thumb over the scar to check that it was still there, tangible proof that some part of me had been altered in the room with the observer. The more we worked, the more we understood that the problem wasn't one of intention, but of scale. Small acts could shift a local event. They had a harder time moving a citywide panic.
Our efforts were a matter of arithmetic applied to attention. Move enough threads in different places and you lower the magnitude at the knots. It was a dilution strategy rather than a cure. Kind of like putting your hand in water to stop it from boiling over by changing the temperature by a fraction. It wasn't satisfying. It didn't absolve us. Then an email arrived that would change the way I slept. It was short and unsigned. The subject line a single word: watch. The body contained one sentence, a coordinate and a time. No explanation, no signature, just a coordinate that led to an industrial area on the fringe of the city and a time in 2 days. We had been warned in fragments before. The observer, in his way, had hinted that the geometry we were tracking might blow up or bloom. The email felt like a summons. It felt like a sign. James called a meeting in the basement. The group gathered with their coats still wet from rain. We placed our hands on the map as if to steady it. Someone had pinned a photograph of a public plaza under a string that wove across a dozen other pins. The photograph was dated last spring, a protest that had started as a town hall dispute and spread into something with teeth. There was a silence in the room when we read the email. I could hear the air fans spinning. "Do we go?" Mara asked. The question was simple and enormous. To go meant to risk becoming a node ourselves, to place our attention into a place that might ignite. To stay meant to avoid risk, but perhaps cede ground to whatever net was tightening. The tension between action and restraint had become our moral engine. I remember looking at the map and feeling the tilt of a head again, across the years and miles. An observer somewhere beyond our comprehension, watching to see what we would do with knowledge that was too large for any one person. I thought of the shard in my pocket and of the cup that had broken without meaning to. My notebook pages were full of lines and small victories and failures. I had been a monitor for as long as I remembered, clerking patterns. But now the job felt different. Monitoring had turned into choice-making. We made a plan, because that is the only way to feel less adrift. A small team would go to the coordinate, not to confront, not to preach, but to observe, and if possible, to cede a small ordinary presence, a table with free water, a person with a simple greeting. We rehearsed in the basement like little actors, careful with our words. We would be a soft presence, nothing heroic, just consistent. I slept poorly for 2 nights. Dreaming had become an occupational hazard. The tilt of head memory arrived like a reproach in the dark. When I closed my eyes, I could feel the geometry of the city's lines as if in muscles, tight where rumor had been fed, flaccid where attention drifted. I had no guarantee that our presence would do anything. I had only the belief, fragile but insistent, that small acts multiplied by many hands could change the slope of a future. We left before dawn. The street was empty and cold. The river of the city had not yet risen to its full noise. The industrial area was a grid of warehouses and loading docks and chain-link fences. The night smelled of oil and wet cardboard. We arrived before dawn with breath steaming in the air, our car lights carving out islands in the dark. James walked with his hands in his pockets. The soldier next to him moved like someone who had practiced being unremarkable. Mara carried a small folding table in one hand and a thermos in the other, as if she were going to a picnic rather than to the mouth of something that might open. I had my notebook, of course. The shard of cup in my pocket felt heavy, like a tooth I had not yet decided to pull. The coordinate led us to a warehouse that had once hummed with fluorescent light and forklifts. Its door sagged on rusted hinges. Someone had spray-painted a name on the side and then painted over it again until the letters became a bruise in the paint. We parked a few blocks off to avoid drawing attention and walked in a line like people who had rehearsed for the possibility of cameras. The city behind us seemed warmer, as if the lights and breakfast carts kept a pressure that didn't exist here. The lobby smelled of dust and something chemical. The main room had a ceiling like a sky someone had forgotten to hang fixtures from. At the center of the floor, the light caught on a single table and a thermos. Around it, chairs formed a small, odd theater. Someone had placed a faded children's blanket in one corner. On the wall, a mural of flaking paint suggested someone once tried to make a place of work almost domestic. A thin thread of sunlight came through a crack in a high window and stained a square on the concrete. It looked like a portal. We set up quietly. The plan was intentionally simple. A table with water, a person with a neutral greeting, a few distributed postcards with the words, "You are seen," the same phrase we'd learned to carry like a talisman. Mara arranged the cups with an almost surgical neatness. The soldier strolled the perimeter and counted exits with a habit that had nothing to do with paranoia and everything to do with muscle memory. James spread out a small sheet of tracing paper and drew nodes where the shipping lanes met bus stops. The receiver sat with her eyes closed and fingers hooked in her lap like someone at prayer. People arrived trickles at first. A delivery driver leaning to peer in, a woman with a child who steadied the stroller with one hand and clutched a bag of groceries in the other. They hesitated, then came closer for the warmth the table offered. They accepted water, then sat and told small stories, the sort of talk that skirts the edge of confession.
A man complained about delays at work. A woman named Carla told us her landlord had given notice without explanation. Each story was a small heat source, and we listened, because listening is one of the methods we have that costs nothing and changes everything. It was later, when the light thinned into a cold blue, that the first ripple happened. A teenager with a skateboard came to the edge of our little gathering and, for reasons none of us could calculate, took out his phone and began to film. He spoke into it with a practiced monotone. "There are people handing out water at the old shipyard. If you're here, come see." He tagged a local channel and put the video up. Nothing dramatic in that, except that the video had a cadence that fit a dozen other videos, and like those, carried a particular tone. We noticed because the receiver's shoulders tightened like a harpstring. The message moved. A handful of people arrived who were not looking for water, they were looking for crowds. They came with the low-level adrenaline of someone seeking validation or perhaps spectacle. A cluster of 2 became 5, then 10. Phones were raised, voices overlapped. Mara tried to steer conversation to practical things. Who needs help? Who's out of work? What can we do today? But the feed had been seeded. Somewhere, eyes turned into a feedback loop. We had rehearsed for observation, not intervention. But rehearsal does not immunize you from the way reality leans into whatever is focused on it. An argument began over space in the queue for water. It started over nothing, a cut in line, a remembered slight, and the energy latched on. I could feel the tilt of attention like a wind shifting. James put a hand on my shoulder, then on another person's sleeve, moving bodies in small, calm gestures that bought a minute. The soldier stepped between 2 men and spoke in the slow voice that had once cleared fields. Mara moved to the edge and started asking people about their children, about places they trusted. We were behaving like fishermen who'd been told not to touch the net, but saw the net snagging on something alive.
Then the sound rose, a shout, sharp and unexpected. Phones rose, footage streamed live, and in the span of a few breathless minutes, the little skirmish made a private knot into a public node. People far away began to comment, their comments slipping like oil on water. The viewer count climbed. When the feed multiplied, something else happened that we had not anticipated. It wasn't simply the number of viewers, it was the tone of the comments that thickened. A rumor, old and hungry, had the shape of a rumor about scarcity. "They're giving bulk supplies to friends," one commenter wrote. "They always do. They're hoarding." The word hoarding is a sharp-edged thing in a public square. It makes someone else's small kindness look like collusion. People grabbed the word and threw it. The focus shifted from the water and the help to accusation, and then to the possibility of theft. A man I had seen accept a cup of water looked suddenly guilty in the glass-lit scrutiny of his phone's camera. His breath shifted. Someone called the police. It was in that moment, when the gathering's heat jumped from human body to collective feed to institutional response, that I felt the old tilt, the observer's tilt, as if the head of some distant thing had nodded and recalibrated us on a new axis. The shard in my pocket vibrated with the pressure of it. I wrote a single line in my notebook: feed to accusation to institution. I had no time to test variables. Observation had become an action in itself. The police arrived. Their presence folded the scene into a different geometry. Uniforms, procedures, the clack of their boots. Orders were barked. People dispersed. Our water table folded into a quiet. The live feed continued. The clip proliferated into other channels. A rumor grew teeth overnight. By morning, the news cycle had a line about assistance groups alleged to be selective, and the rumor peeled off into neighborhoods with histories that fed on suspicion. We had watched a thread tie to 100 others and send tremors outward. Back in the basement days later, we circled the mapping wall and traced the path of that night's spread. James placed a new pin at the warehouse and drew threads outward to digital forums and neighborhood feeds and to a central node, a news outlet that recirculated the clip with a headline leaning into controversy. "This is why you can't just show up," someone muttered. We were small and simple, and then we became a mirror. The mirror was cruel. The observer's silence, which had felt like a measure, now felt like a test. I remember sitting with my notebook open and the map unwound across the plywood like a living thing, and thinking, knowledge makes gravity. The more you know of the lines, the more you discover your care is itself a new source of weight. We changed tactics that week. Not in philosophy, our ethics still frowned on coercion, but in the mechanics of how we would seed. We stopped doing anything that could be framed as an act exclusive to some and not others. We moved away from the stage and toward embedded presence. Instead of a visible table, we placed small, neutral acts that looked like the city's ordinary kindnesses. Garbage collected from a corner, benches painted a neutral gray, a library volunteer who stayed a little later. We learned to be indistinguishable from the city's regular heartbeat. The artist painted small, unbranded tiles that said nothing more provocative than "You are seen" in corners where rumor liked to breed. The student volunteers handed out coupons for free chargers at random, a small kindness that didn't make a good headline. Months slid like this, a set of carefully measured entries in our field reports, a few victories, a few stumbles.
The mapping wall grew, as did the group. More people arrived with their own ways of noticing. A retired teacher who could still remember PTA meeting chants from the 70s. A nurse who had a way of moving through an emergency room that soothed panic. A quiet younger man who used his involvement in online forums to thread neutral facts into trending conversations. We were a ragtag constellation of practice. Then the vision came. It was not a vision in the sense of the supernatural light shows you'd see in movies. It arrived in a warehouse, because so much of our serious work happened in places where the city forgot to breathe. James had called a meeting and said only, "There is something we need to see together." He asked that we all come prepared to sit. The room had candles, odd because we rarely used candlelight for meetings, and the artist had draped fabrics across chairs as if to make the basement less like a lab and more like a chapel of attention. The receiver had been silent for days and looked both tired and preternaturally alert. The group settled into rows. Someone put a cup of coffee down that steamed like a small, low cloud. The soldier took his hat off and sat with his hands folded. Mara perched on the edge of a seat like a person bracing for a jump. I fumbled with my notebook and the shard in my pocket, tucking it out of sight. The air was thick with the smell of wax and old paper. Someone closed the basement door as if to keep the world out. For a long time, there was nothing. We had meetings that were simply someone explaining a case or a new test design. This was not one of those meetings. After a while, I became aware of a low sound at the edge of hearing, the kind of frequency you feel in your skeleton rather than hear with your ears. The receiver's eyes opened like someone waking from sleep. She placed her hand flat on the table and said very softly, "They're starting it." "What are they?" asked Mara. The receiver's hand moved in a slow arc, describing a shape in the air. It was not a shape I could have named at first. It felt like the outline of a globe, only drawn with threads. The room changed the way an instrument changes when you retune it. The painted walls muted, the type of light shifted. I felt the tilt, that small, precise motion, as if the observer's head was moving across space and measuring the room. Then, without words, the room opened. If I had to describe what we saw, I would use words we used for charts and words we used for myth. Imagine a map that is also a sky. From the center of the basement rose, in the space of a heartbeat, a geometry of light so fine it could have been dust and so massive it could have been a continent. Threads, thin as hair, extended like nerves from every node we'd ever pinned on our wall. Cities glowed where pins stood. The threads pulsed in a beat we did not name, but felt in our chests.
Where threads crossed, knots formed, knots that shone brighter than the threads. Each knot felt like an intention focused until it took shape. A voice, not a voice like a man talking, but a modulation in the air, gave us a sense more than a sentence. This is the fabric we've been tracking. No one spoke. We watched while the threads rearranged themselves into patterns our maps had hinted at but not fully shown. The pattern was not random. It had eddies and currents, places where a rumor could circulate until it built pressure. Places where institutional weight amplified a small ember into a blaze. The observer's presence, minimal and clinical, felt like the hand that set a protractor on a universe and measured the angle of each connection. Then the screen of the vision widened. We were no longer in the basement. The threads stretched beyond the city's borders, crossing oceans, climbing continents like a lattice spun by a planetary spider. Where a thread corresponded to a certain type of attention, scarcity, blame, righteous outrage, a particular color emerged. Fear showed as blue-black shimmer. Anger shone molten red. Resilience looked faint green and hopeful, but required a concentration to sustain. We saw in that suspended thing that wasn't a movie, but something closer to a living report, how nodes coalesced. A rumor in a market in one city hooked to a social feed in another. An editorial amplified a complaint that began in a kitchen table conversation. A small band of activists, fueled by righteous anger, coordinated to occupy a zone, and the lattice wrapped around them, pulling in threads until the occupation became a policy battle and a supply chain question, and ultimately a shadow on mass access to food or medicine. It was as if human attention had its own weather system, and where pressure dropped, storms formed. The viewer in me, the monitor in me, tried to log variables, but the vision refused to be a neat spreadsheet. It was evocative and horrific, and most of all, urgent. As the lattice tightened in certain areas, little timers began to appear at the knots. Not mechanical timers exactly, but impressions of countdowns, a feeling of increasing momentum, a sense that if left uninterrupted, these nodes would lock into themselves and become self-sustaining. James's hand moved without his consent. He mouthed the word critical. No one had to say it. The psychic shape of the term was there in the air like smoke. In the vision, the observer, not the man in the interview room, but the force that had tilted and measured, did not speak in human sentences. It presented metrics. It showed us how long an alignment had to persist and at what scale before it began to harden. He showed us histories in shards, other species, ambiguous in whether he meant cultures, populations, or something stranger, who had touched the same thresholds and folded into outcomes they could not reverse.
The images of those past failures were fragmentary. A city that stopped hearing itself, a civilization that turned inward and cannibalized resources, a silence after a climax that never regained its sound. The implication was not a prophecy, but a lesson. A threshold exists, and the geometry of attention can either be held loosely or tightened until the seams give way. I felt the scar in my palm like a secret instrument calibrating to each image. The observer's presence in the vision was precise and not cruel. It felt like being shown a lab result where one of the lines read abnormal. The science of it was alien. The ethical burden belonged to us. "How close?" whispered Mara, though in the vision her question seemed to echo as if translated across miles. The response was not a number, but a shape. The lattice contracted in certain areas, and the timers shimmered. 1 knot, a region where economic anxiety, rumor, and policy friction had all overlapped, pulsed an urgent red. Another knot, in a far-off coast, glowed a low amber, and its timer seemed to stutter as if someone were blowing on it. Those stutters were the most important things we saw. The possibility of slowing, of diluting. They were, in short, what hope looked like when you knew how to read it. When the vision receded, the room exhaled as if recovering from holding breath too long. The receiver's cheeks were wet. She had been crying silently. James sat curled over, his knuckles white. The soldier looked as if he had seen a map where to move troops, and the look on his face suggested the wrong kind of response. Urgency that easily transmutes into force. We had no miraculous remedy. The observer had not handed down instructions. He had only shown us the geometry, and, in a way that didn't feel like condescension, made the moral cost of knowledge plain. We had been given a chart of danger, and the humbling reminder that free will is absolute. There was no lever to yank that could remove the choices people made. The vision made that crystalline. We could sow, we could model, we could seed attention differently, but we could not override the agency of millions. Afterward, the basement was silent except for the low scraping of chairs. We spoke in low voices, trading impressions rather than strategy. The artist wanted to make a series of pieces that would act as literal dampeners. The retired teacher argued for curriculum work in schools about emotional literacy. The nurse proposed training volunteers in trauma-informed presence so neighborhoods could manage their own flares. Mara wanted a program of distributed gentle nudges scaled by algorithmic randomness to avoid pattern detection. The soldier cautioned against any approach that could be framed as manipulative. He feared the optics would turn our method into its own threat.
We argued late into the night, drawing new loops on the mapping wall, drawing strategies that were less about pushing tides and more about changing the gusts. It was in that debate that James slid a sheet of paper across the table. On it was a single sentence in his precise handwriting. "We have until the seams set. We don't know the hour. We know the tendency." There was no dramatic flourish in that phrase, but the implication was suffocating. We were not playing a game with a restart button. We were careening toward a threshold that felt like a tide. The vision had not told us exactly when. It had told us the geometry we needed to know. That geometry suggested urgency, and the word terrifying fit like a bitter glove. After the meeting, we adopted a multi-pronged plan. Scale small things, inoculate nodes by saturating them with ordinary presence, cultivate networks of receivers and blockers in key urban centers, build a training program for volunteers who could be neutral, non-judgmental anchors in moments of spike. We would not try to convert, we would model. We called the plan Dilution and wrote Protocol 47 to describe it. It read like a compromise between hope and humility. Plant ordinary acts, scale them where necessary, measure without fixing. We started to catalog the sites we could influence quickly: transit hubs, school PTA groups, local market organizers, forums where rumors first concentrated. We used low-tech signals, painted benches, community gardeners, late-night library volunteers, precisely because they didn't attract the spotlight. It was a credo of invisibility. Change the attention economy without becoming the news. The artist built a suite of public tiles, each with an abstract shape designed not to go viral, but to be touched. We distributed them quietly through community centers. The nurse taught a team of volunteers how to move their bodies in ways that suggested calmness without being performative. We created anonymous guides for online moderators to insert neutral facts and kindness into heated threads. There were costs. Some members left because the ethical burden of secrecy or the discomfort of being wrongly accused was too much. Others wanted more direct action. Some pulled us toward public campaigns that could have backfired catastrophically if they had been misinterpreted. The group shrank and stretched in waves. That too was instructive. Movement happens in a tension between collective scale and individual conscience. Over months, the map did not stay the same. Sometimes the threads thinned. The timers in my dreams stuttered and slid back. There were neighborhoods that calmed, where weeks earlier small fevers had brewed. A vendor returned a lost child in an area where we'd seeded kindness. The small victories felt like stitches in a worn garment. We recorded them in our field reports with the same neutral tone we used to record failures.
Wins had to be logged carefully so we didn't mythologize them into proof. The last thing we wanted was to become believers rather than observers. But nothing erased the image of the lattice and its knots. The vision's memory sat beside my pen on nights I tried to write and had nowhere else to go. It was clearer after the vision that our work would be arithmetic applied to attention. The more threads we could nudge, the lower the load at the knots. We could not unmake the physics of attention, but we could change its math. At some point in the following months, a coordinated series of small actions in 3 different cities, a mural, a volunteer network distributing water, a set of online moderators who inserted calming context into trending threads, coincided with a particular tense week of market anxiety. The maps we checked that night showed a small, remarkable thing. A knot that had been bright and pulsing was dimmer. The timer that used to shimmer had slowed. It was not a reversal. It was a delay, the dilution. The receiver said it felt like fingers eased from a throat. We logged it as a partial success. Partial successes were toxic and salve at once. They encouraged us and reminded us of our impotence. We celebrated with coffee and more notations. We knew the lattice could thicken again. The observer had shown us pattern, but not promise, and that was a stern gift. The moral responsibility of knowing settled into my life like a second profession.
I learned to carry my attention deliberately. I trimmed my online presence because every comment I wrote was a small weight. I moved my routines toward acts that had neutral or benevolent outflows, checking on neighbors, listening without seeking to persuade, refusing to feed rumor by sharing unverified clips. People in the group developed small rituals to protect themselves from becoming nodes. The receiver would sing a note into a closed hand when she felt the swarm. The soldier practiced breathing techniques that opened his chest instead of closing it. These were not spiritual shortcuts. They were ways to avoid being sucked into the world. The shard in my pocket remained. It had become a talisman of accident and consequence. When I was anxious, I would rub its edge along the seam in my palm and remember the cup dropping, the ordinary collision that had seemed at first like an insult on a sidewalk, and later like the hinge of my life. The shard meant I had been altered, that knowledge had been placed in me without consent, and that I could not pretend ignorance as an ethical posture. We kept counting the people we reached through low-key interventions. We kept a ledger of how many community benches had been painted, how many tiles had been placed, how many moderators had been trained. We published nothing. The work was not for the spotlight. Sometimes a local church community would mention our work in a whisper. Sometimes a local city planner would pull out a tile by mistake and keep it.
The numbers grew slowly in a way that felt like the aggregation of small grains. I remember a morning when I walked past a subway station on my way to a meeting and saw 3 teenagers sitting on a bench, one with a tile under his shoe. They argued about a video game, an ordinary, trivial conversation. I felt something like relief. The lattice, in that corner of the globe, had a little less tension that day. But relief is a dangerous currency. The vision had taught us that small changes could be swallowed by pattern if the net thickened again. There would be no single triumph. The idea of a countdown remained. It was not a ticking clock with a final chime so much as a metric of probability, a growing likelihood that if enough knots locked, the broader fabric would shift. Months turned into a year. The group matured. We formalized Protocol 72, which described training for community anchors. We started to work with existing organizations rather than trying to become them. A network of voluntary presence partners emerged, librarians, union clerks, market vendors, who were not activists but who understood the value of stability. We taught them small practices, how to ask a question that opens conversation rather than locks it, how to offer a neutral physical act like a cup of water without framing it as charity or spectacle, how to notice the first whisper of rumor and introduce a different thread by naming what people were feeling. There were tragedies along the way. A nudge misfired and inflamed an old grievance in a town where the wounds were too raw. We had to own that failure. We brought in trauma counselors and helped rebuild trust, which was slow and humbling work. The observer did not step in. He watched. We also had moments that felt like proof that direction mattered. A campaign coordinated across 4 cities to defuse a rumor about medicine shortages resulted in, according to our measures, a slight reduction in panic buying. The maps displayed a slight flattening of the knot, not a solution, a dampening, enough perhaps to prevent a catastrophic cascade. We celebrated quietly and recorded the outcome in the ledger with sober pleasure. That season of small wins and sober losses made me into someone different. I had been a clerk of anomalies. Now I was an elder in a kind of craft. I still monitored alien activity in the original sense of the observer's otherness, and in the broader sense of how outside forces, rumor, institutional momentum, human attention could shape outcomes. The listener in me had become a practitioner of prevention that was nothing like the managerial language the world preferred. My notebooks bloomed with enumerations. Protocol 19, how to listen without prompting. Protocol 34, how to route a rumor into public facts rather than venom. Protocol 88, how to assemble a tile distribution without creating spectacle. There was no single breakthrough.
There was only the steady arithmetic labor of shifting threads. Some nights I bedded down believing we had slowed the timer. Other nights the dream returned, a lattice tightening into glass, and then the world going still. The shard was cold against my hand. I would sit and write a field report in the small hours, trying to translate what we had seen into an ethic a reader could live with. One of the more difficult lessons was accepting that free will meant we could not prevent catastrophe by fiat. People would choose fear, people would choose outrage. The observer's strictness about agency was either an ethical constraint placed on us by cosmic law or an observation about the weight of consequence. I could not decide which. It didn't matter. The point remained. We could not control minds. We could only show a way that made certain choices easier, quieter, less lethal. We also learned that hope is not a state, but a skill. It requires fidelity, repetition, and the willingness to act without applause. The group contracted and expanded. New faces arrived with different capacities. Data analysts who had the humility to trace threads without naming causation as inevitable. Theater directors who taught us ways to model calm presence that didn't read as performance. The retired teacher organized workshops in neighborhood centers that taught children how to notice rumor, not as a media literacy exercise, but as a social skill. Over time, the number of nodes we had some influence over increased. The timers at some knots blinked slower. That was progress, measured not by spectacle, but by arithmetic. When I look back, I see that the tilt of the observer's head never left us. It receded sometimes into the background, a measure. Other times it returned, precise and unreadable. Once, in a meeting that had convened because of a sudden spike in a distant region, we got an anonymous message, a photograph of a skyline with one building lit in a single window. Someone had drawn an arrow on the image and written, "Observe." It was the same kind of summons that had led us to the warehouse months ago. We debated whether we needed to go. We debated for hours about how much our action could themselves become a node. James said, "We are already nodes. The question is whether we'll be nodes that stabilizes or nodes that inflames." The ethical argument never settled. It sharpened into policy. We would only go when local partners requested, and when our presence would not become the story. We became more methodical. We documented everything. We tried to be invisible. If you're still with me, then you know this is not a neat story with a closed ending. The lattice is not solved. There is no single moral that will fit comfortably on a t-shirt. What we have learned, what I have learned after the tilt and the shard and the countless small entries in notebooks that smell faintly of coffee, is twofold. First, human attention accumulates into architecture.
That architecture can benefit or harm at scale. Small repeated feelings, fear, outrage, generosity, tenderness, do not evaporate, they stack. Over time, with certain alignments, they can lock into patterns that shape resources, policies, and lived harm. Second, knowledge of this system is itself a responsibility. To see the threads without acting is to be complicit in the structures you observe. To act without humility risks becoming another engine of harm. The work we do is to move threads in the direction of durability and care, using small, ordinary acts, not through spectacle or coercion. There is a countdown that is more about probability and geometry than a fixed date. Some knots are closer than others. We have slowed some. We have failed to slow others. We have learned that the most effective interventions are those that amplify ordinary stability. Cooks who keep their soup lines calm, librarians who teach listening, transit workers who know to open doors instead of shouting orders, online moderators who can rewrite a thread toward context instead of accusation.
These are not glamorous solutions. They are not marketable as breakthroughs. They are the scaffolding of a possible future. I do not tell you this to persuade you into fear. I tell you because the observer showed us the shape of a threat that is both invisible and mortal in its consequences. The terrifying part of what's coming next is not an alien armada or a movie-ready apocalypse. It is a slow, mathematical folding of everyday human attention into realities that can deprive millions of food, medicine, and safety, and do so in a way that feels inevitable once a knot forms. There is hope, but it is proportional to our willingness to act small and act together. The race is not to pull levers, but to cultivate habits that change the arithmetic. That is why we ask people gently to start with observation. For 2 weeks, notice where your attention goes when you open your phone, when you hear a rumor, when you stand in line. Notice how often you fuel anger, how often you pass along scarcity without checking. That's all. 2 weeks of watching and noting, not to become a proselyte, but to see your influence. If 10,000 people did that in networks and neighborhoods, the lattice would feel different. It would not be saved. It might be altered enough to avoid certain catastrophic foldings. I am not promising miracles. I am offering a practice of attention. Observe, record, shift if needed. Learn to be a neutral presence when possible. Model steadiness. Use kindness as a tool, not a sermon. If this sounds like a small ask, it's because it is. Smallness is the point. Months into our program, an editor asked me in a tentative email whether I believed the observer wanted humanity to wake up or to fail. I could not answer with certainty. The observer, when he had chosen to give us the tilt and the vision, behaved like an examiner rather than a savior.
His motives, if he had motives we could name, were not ours to claim. He had given us data and a moral burden. Whether that gift was benevolent or merely observational is a question I still carry without resolution. What I do know is this: the knowledge changed me. It made me more careful, less tempted by spectacle, and more willing to accept a life in which heroics are mostly routines repeated at low volume. I monitor alien activity for a living, and what comes next, if my years of watching and the warehouse vision mean anything, is terrifying in the particular way that ordinary people can, together, be the architects of catastrophe. It is terrifying because it is also banal. It does not scream, it accrues. If you want to try what we ask, start small. For the next 2 weeks, keep a notebook. When you feel a surge, outrage, fear, the urge to share a clip, pause and write down what triggered me. What did I want to happen? Who benefited if this escalated? Who would lose? Observe without judgment. After 2 weeks, you will have data about your attention. That data does not make you guilty. It makes you informed. If enough of us did that, the lattice would look different. If you want to go deeper, there is a modest resource we put together. A short guide with templates for 2-week observation, a few protocols for safe, low-profile presence, and a set of reflection questions. It's not a miracle product. It's a notebook and a series of suggestions that we have tested and refined. You'll find a link in the description below. Use it if you want. No promises, no guarantees, just practice. The shard in my pocket is lighter now, perhaps worn down by habit. The tilt of the observer's head is a measure I cannot unlearn. I still monitor. I still map. I still carry the ledger of small victories and quiet failures. The lattice is still there. The timers still flicker in the places we cannot always reach. But there is also work to do that is modest and concrete. Observe, be present, seed ordinary acts of kindness that do not demand applause. If this testimony moves you, do one small thing. Notice your attention for 2 weeks, and if you feel called,
follow the resource in the description. If not, at least live with the knowledge that your thoughts are not private until you make them so. I do not know whether we will avert the worst. I do know that watching without action is complicity, and action without humility is its own catastrophe. There is terrifying work ahead, yes, but there is also a path that does not require superpowers, only discipline, steadiness, and the patience to be ordinary in a world that mistakes spectacle for change. If you decide to try the 2-week observation, write down what you find. If you want support beyond that, the guide below offers a quiet structure. No huckster's promises, just practices we've used in the basement, in warehouses, and in the margins of city life. I monitor alien activity for a living.
I have seen the tilt. I have been marked. The future is not fixed. It is a math of attention. Terrifying? Yes. Avoidable? Maybe, if enough of us learn to carry our focus with care. If you want the guide to the 2-week observation or to learn more about the protocols we use, there is one resource linked below. It's optional, it's modest, it is not a fix. It is a tool for people who want to start noticing. If nothing else, spend 2 weeks watching your own patterns. That is where everything begins.